The Enlightenment in America was similar to the Enlightenment in Europe that we studied last semester. If you think about some of the influences of some of the great European Enlightenment philosophers, like Isaac Newton, well, not so much a philosopher, but a scientist who talked about the natural laws of motion and the natural laws of physics. And if you remember, he said that all these laws were absolute and unchanging. He didn't deny the existence of God, but he said that God is more like a clockmaker, that he had made these laws of motion and that they always existed, they never changed, and he didn't influence those laws on a daily basis. He just set the world in motion, much like a clockmaker makes a clock and sets the gears and the springs, and then the clock just functions. The clockmaker could fix a clock if it breaks, like God could come in and intervene in the world, but he doesn't typically do that. This idea of natural laws eventually led to people like John Locke, who talked about natural rights of humans. If you remember during the Glorious Revolution of England that we talked about with Governor Andros in Massachusetts and Leisler's Rebellion in New York, the Glorious Revolution was a peaceful overthrow of James II, the monarch of England, who was Catholic. And when he peacefully stepped down and they brought in William and Mary, the new monarchs, they had to agree to the English Bill of Rights. In a sense, they had to make a social contract with the people of England to become the monarchs. John Locke lived through this time and was inspired by the Glorious Revolution, so he comes up with his 2 treatises on government that he writes that talks about natural rights of people. If you remember, those are life, liberty, and property. And when he says property, he's not talking again about land. He's talking about your livelihood, your income, all the things you use to sustain your life. John Locke also talks about the social contract in the 2 treatises of government, the idea that people have to agree to their government, and that's what gives government its authority or its legitimacy. This is the idea of popular sovereignty. And he said that if the government no longer protects your rights, then people have a right to overthrow it. Very influential on Thomas Jefferson and the American Revolution later on. If you remember, we studied Baron de Montesquieu, who also was a French philosopher who talked about separation of powers, that they need to take the executive, the legislative, and the judicial and break them into different groups. Otherwise, you could have an abuse of power by one. This is very influential on the way that colonial assemblies developed, colonial governments, and very influential on our Constitution much later down the road. All this stuff was based, if you remember, on the idea of rationalism, that there's rational explanations for why things happen in nature, there's rational explanations for people's relationship with each other and to their government. And this is much different than this, you might say, the faith explanations of way things happen. Some people might call them superstitious ways that things happen. Or even it's, as far as like why there's thunder and there's storms, there's rational explanations for those. But even it goes into the idea there's rational explanations for how people should relate to the government. This idea gets transposed later on to, should a king rule just because he was born into the family? Does that make him a good king? That's not a rational way to choose a leader. And Americans start to embrace this idea of rationalism as they move forward to the revolution. And you see pictured here, Benjamin Franklin is the stereotypical or the most well-known American Enlightenment philosopher. And he's known for all kinds of practical inventions that you may have studied before, like bifocals he invents. He comes up with the first public fire department in Philadelphia. And most famously, you kind of see pictured in this painting him doing his experiments with a kite and lightning, where he didn't invent electricity, but he starts doing experiments with electricity, having a key on the string, flying a kite during a storm, and trying to see how electricity would travel down the kite and through the key. And this painting's interesting. It's painted by Benjamin West in the 1830s. So it's painted long after Benjamin Franklin's already been an influential figure in the revolution, and he's passed away, and it's making him look like a hero with a kind of the flowing Superman-y cape behind him. He's got these angels around him doing all his experiments and helping him fly the kite. And if you look closely at his hand, the lightning has gone through the kite, through the key, and is going into his knuckle, like he's harnessing lightning itself. So the Enlightenment's a big movement in America at the time, promoting rational responses to the world and to government. And it's going to be very influential on the American Revolution. The downside to it is that to be rational, sometimes it takes away from faith. And we already know that in New England in particular, in the colonies, faith was fading. People weren't going to church as much as they used to. Therefore, they had the halfway covenant. People were afraid of witches and the devil around them. You had the witchcraft trials. People were being more consumed with wealth and material belongings and pursuing professions rather than God. So the Enlightenment helps lead into that, a little bit of drawing people away from faith, because people start looking at deism, this idea of a supreme being, but not necessarily a Christian God, where people start looking for rational explanations rather than faithful explanations. And all these things lead to the First Great Awakening. this big religious revival in the early 1700s that started throughout the colonies. Started up in Northampton, Massachusetts by Jonathan Edwards, who you see pictured on their right with the painting he's holding his hands over one of the people in his congregation. Jonathan Edwards gave fiery sermons about fire and brimstone and how God is holding you over a pit of brimstone down in HE double hockey sticks, and he's the only thing that's keeping you from falling into it. And people are so despicable and sinful in God's eyes that he looks at them like insects and he's ready to cast them into the flames. But he says if you're willing to be born again or come back to God or make decisions on your own about your faith and change your ways, then God would take you back. This is important. Think about this idea of being born again into Christianity. He doesn't necessarily say predestination is wrong, but that's what really drives Calvinist theology and Puritan theology, predestination. And if you're making a conscious decision to be born again into the faith, then that's not really predestination. So there's an element maybe of democracy in there, or people having some control over their salvation. So do they have control over their lives, control over their government, maybe the revolution? So there's an element of that in there. But a lot of people came back to religion. A lot of the kids, the younger generations, had kind of faded away and didn't find church interesting, came back. These fire and brimstone speeches would have people come up and testify and be witnesses to God and to be overcome with the Holy Spirit, and sometimes fall on the ground in like either ecstasy or pain as God was exorcising demons and sins. And it caused this huge movement back to the churches, but it also caused division in the churches, that kids were going to, the younger generations were going to these new, more kind of fire and brimstone preachers like Jonathan Edwards, and they didn't want to go to the preachers and the ministers of their parents' kind of generation. So we see churches divided. We have groups of people called New Lights that went to these more Great Awakening revivalists. We had Old Lights who went to the old Great Awakening revivalists, or the old, not old Great Awakening, but the old ministers of their parents' generation. So churches are divided. People start voting on or deciding on who's the right minister. Kids disobey parents. They challenge their authority by going to these new churches. They disobey or challenge the authority of their ministers by going to these new churches. So there's another element of revolution in there. You see pictured down in the bottom left, George Whitefield, a British or English preacher that came over here, and he came down to Georgia first and worked his way north through the colonies, giving revivals. And we're going to watch a little bit of a video on him coming up in this presentation that talks about his impact on unifying the Americans in their culture and spreading this Great Awakening.
In the 18th century, the English colonies in America encountered a new and different form of religious expression: revivalism. Part of a broader evangelical movement taking place in England, Scotland, and Wales, this great awakening of religious fervor swept across the Atlantic and into the colonies.
First Great Awakening occurred in America in the late 1730s into the early 1740s, when it peaked around 1741-42. It was a time of tremendous religious upheaval in American life. For some, it was a great blessing. For others, it was just mass enthusiasm.
We have to understand these revivals not as bringing in people who had never heard the Word of God. This is not like missions to, people in foreign lands. The people hearing this Word had actually been, most of them, churchgoers already.
Usually we date the beginning of the awakening with a revival that took place in Jonathan Edwards's parish in Northampton, Massachusetts in 1734 or 1735.
Jonathan Edwards was not an emotional sort of preacher. Jonathan Edwards was a true intellectual. In fact, Jonathan Edwards is regarded by many scholars as one of a handful, just a small handful of original thinkers that America has produced.
He became pastor of the church in Northampton when his grandfather, Solomon Stoddard, passed away. When he inherited the church, he called it a church of dry bones.
And he said he is powerfully impacted that he is preaching to an unconverted people, and it breaks his heart.
So he began to preach about the doctrines of grace. He began to preach about personal responsibility and renewal.
And you have this experience that we call conversions, not just one person at a time, but 10, 20, 50, 100 people at a time being converted. And then a kind of ripple effect from there on.
Newspaper reporters come to see what's happening. Over 300 people are converted in Northampton, Massachusetts. over 100 of them in a single Sunday.
From New England, the revival then, rather surprisingly, takes a turn toward the South. And that is really the inception of evangelicalism in the South. It's at that point that the South puts itself on a path to becoming the Bible Belt.
There would be fervent preaching, sometimes 2 and 3 or 4 hours, maybe 2 or 3 preachers. And so sometimes preaching services would last an entire day.
People were crying out during worship. Sometimes people were fainting during worship. Worship was held at all kinds of hours.
So what the Great Awakening did in part was to stimulate religious fervor and also tend to authenticate the kind of religious practices of the working class or the lower classes.
These scattered revivals then began to be strung together when a young English evangelist by the name of George Whitefield showed up in colonial America in 1739.
George Whitefield was a young, feisty, in-your-face Church of England clergyman who felt he'd been called to proclaim repentance before God and faith in Jesus Christ.
George Whitefield, the great evangelist of the Great Awakening, was the first American star that everybody heard about, everybody came out to see.
Benjamin Franklin was amazed when he came to Philadelphia. He estimated that he spoke to 20,000 people. He did it without amplification. And it was said of Whitefield that he could make one weep by the way he pronounced Mesopotamia.
He carried a special folding pulpit that he could step onto so that he could be seen above the crowds, because so often there were thousands of people coming to see him.
He preached to more people by manyfold in Boston over a 10-day period than were in Boston. He addressed a crowd on Boston Commons that probably came close to the entire population of the town.
He preached over 18,000 sermons on American soil from Maine to Georgia. Every living American, I dare say, knew who this man was, and many of them, there were only 3 million Americans back then, many Americans had heard him preach.
He did not plan his sermons. When his traveling secretary was asked once about how Whitefield prepared sermons, he laughed and said, "I did not know he engaged in such activities. He would take a scripture and then just go for broke."
People would come from all denominations to hear him. And so the First Great Awakening, it's important to remember, was an across-denominational event for Americans.
You've got slave and free, black and white, educated, uneducated. You've got highborn or commoners, as they were, the rich or poor, we would say, as they said back then. You've got all these different kinds of people standing shoulder to shoulder in the same crowd, hearing the same gospel, that God is no respecter of persons, that if you're going to be saved, you've got to come to Jesus the same way everybody else does. You know, down on your knees with your hands open. You've got nothing to bring except your need of God's forgiveness and mercy.
Ethnic barriers, racial barriers, gender barriers were cut across the line in the Awakening.
And I think some of the religious associations that had come out of the Great Awakening was one of the first times that people in these disparate colonies had sort of been on the same page.
And the First Great Awakening was that event that began to many people on the path to thinking of themselves as a separate people, as a people for the first time, because this was the first national event in American history.
And that idea of individual experience of grace began to feed into emerging ideals of American independence and American individualism.
And so people speak up, they get energized, they participate, they overthrow ministers they don't like. And in that deeper, more cultural or social way, religion can be seen as a kind of backdrop or pre-cause of the American Revolution.
We look at colonial culture during this time period of the early 1700s. We see some architectural and artistic developments. If we look at architecture itself, we see some Georgian homes, not named after the colony of Georgia, but after King George I in England. We haven't studied the monarchs of England in great detail, but if you remember, we talked about William and Mary, who were the Glorious Revolution monarchs. When they die without a male heir, Queen Anne becomes a queen. She dies without a male heir, and the Georgian or the Hanoverian family from Germany become the next ruling family, related through, I think, a cousin. And George I is the first king, then George II, the third, all the way through, I believe, George V. George III will be the king during the Revolution. These houses, these Georgian houses, are named after King George and the Hanoverian families. And if you look at the way these houses are designed, right over above the door of both the brick and the wooden house is some ornamental pediment. The one in the brick house is more simple, it's just a triangular pediment. It looks very much like a Greek revival house or a Greek house or the front of a Greek temple. The pediment on top of the house on the right, a little bit more decorative. If you think about it, in the world where there's no power tools and no assembly lines or anything like that, all that stuff has to be carved by hand with hand tools, which would take an incredibly long amount of time, which means it costs a lot of money for them to have something like that in their house. And it's purely decorative, so it's in a lot of ways just showing off the wealth. This is the style of houses that was big in England, so when Americans found out about these styles of houses, where merchants had seen them, then Americans wanted to have them too, which tells us a little bit about in the 1700s, the early 1700s, that Americans were thinking about themselves as something slightly different than Britons, but they also still thought of themselves as Britons. They were British subjects in America, and they often were caught up in trying to copy the styles and fashions of people living in Britain. The house on the right is interesting. If you look at the top, there's a little fence in the top. It's called a widow's walk, where women who were married to merchants, since merchants had about a 1 in 3 chance of, or sailors, I should say, had a 1 in 3 chance of dying at sea, wives would often go up and stand on the roofs on those widow walks and look for their husbands coming back from the port. If they're expecting him today, they might stand up there today and then tomorrow until they came back, and named widow walks for the women who never had their husbands come home. The one in this picture is more decorative than it is functional, but a little piece of maritime history. So we have Georgian houses, people copying British fashions in houses. We look at art. Americans start having some really more, might say, artistically talented artists or more developed artistic skills. We looked at some of the art before of the early American colonist painters, colonial painters, like the freak portraits, where although they were good for their time, were limited in their skill. We have now people like John Singleton Copley, one of the most famous American artists, especially of that time period, from Boston, and he is painting things like this painting here is his half brother. It's called Boy the Squirrel. And if you look at the skill in there, look at his hair, the shine on his hair, the reflection on the varnish of the table that he's at. And if you look under his right hand, there's a glass of water, incredibly hard to paint. He's got a flying squirrel on his desk, which seems kind of odd. Why would he have that? And if you look closely at it, there's a golden chain coming from his right hand going to the squirrel. It almost looks like the squirrel's on a leash, but they're both kind of playing with this gold chain. So you might say, why does he paint a squirrel in there? John Singleton Copley wanted to be admitted into the London Academy of Art. In a sense, he had to make an application, a portfolio. So this is one of the paintings he used as his application portfolio. And he throws a squirrel in there. It's actually a flying squirrel, which was native to North America. Europe didn't have flying squirrels. So this is kind of like almost like something to throw in there to get people interested in it, to have them remember it, the novelty of this flying squirrel. So if they're looking at a bunch of paintings of artists and they're trying to decide who to give the opening in the art school to, this maybe sticks out of their mind. Say, oh, remember that painting with that flying squirrel, how unique that was. And even if you look at his right hand, it has a chain on it. Hands are incredibly hard to draw and paint. It's always been, if you look back through, art history, they're always one of the things that seem to be the most awkward. So not only is he painting his half-brother's hand, but he has his half-brother put his hand in this kind of unique pose where he's fiddling with a chain to show off just how good he can paint a hand. There's some other paintings by him. These are paintings of two daughters that he paints. You have the satin dresses, and you can see compared to some of our earlier paintings, much more detail, much more skill. Looks actually like fabric, has a shine of satin. The folds look like they could be real material. And if you look closely at the girl in the blue dress's hand, she's holding a hummingbird. And similar to the last one, hummingbird was unique to North America, so she's holding this hummingbird as if Americans are like one with nature. They're dressed up, fancy in this painting. And it's again to draw people's attention to the fact that, this is a unique American painting. And the girl in the golden dress is holding a puppy, which is a little less unique. But and we could assume that the hummingbird wasn't sitting there posing, and he paints that in there. The girl's pose, and he paints in the hummingbird, same thing with the puppy. But you see a much more developed sense of art skill. One of his most famous paintings in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston is Watson and the Shark. And you can look at this painting, and in the bottom right corner of the painting, you can see the shark's mouth a bit. It's not a very, you might say by today's standards, a very good painting of a shark, but people probably hadn't really seen sharks that much that time, at least not up close, Shark Week, so it's not a bad version of a shark for someone who hasn't really seen one. And the guy in the water who's naked fell in the water. So this is a story about an event that happened off the coast of Cuba at the port of Havana. The guy in the real life story wasn't naked in the painting, but he's painting this guy naked to show off again his art skill, to draw attention to it so you remember it, show off his ability to paint the anatomy. This painting is also interesting because it's a shout out in some ways to some Renaissance painters. The two guys in the boat that are reaching down into the water are almost a direct copy of some paintings of Michelangelo in the Sistine Chapel. And the guy in the water who's naked is a copy of someone from a Raphael painting of the Transfiguration of Jesus, who was having demons kind of sent out from his body when Jesus was announced as the Son of God. So it's kind of neat that they, it's not really plagiarism. It's their way of saying, look, here's these painters. I greatly admire them, but also, in some ways, I'm on the same level as they are. It's another painting by another American colonial painter, Benjamin West, who paints the death of General Wolfe. So you have read about, hopefully by now, the French and Indian War. And General Wolfe, the main figure in the middle, is he's dying. He's been shot at the Plains of Abraham when they were trying to take Quebec. This is painted a little bit later again, but showing some development of colonial painters. Benjamin West painted before the Revolution and after the Revolution, and he painted a lot in Europe when he was there. But we start seeing, again, the idea that painters have leisure time. They've developed some skills. They're capturing uniquely American topics that shows that they have an interest in that, rather than just painting classical topics like the Renaissance, the Greeks and Romans, or painting Americans and what's happening there. Go back to this small thing. This is just a dice they would have for a game called Teetotum that they would play, kind of a gambling game that you could either play for money or for entertainment. If we were in class, we would play it, but we're not in class, so we won't. We also see during this time the development of education. Now, we know in Massachusetts they had laws, the old Diluter Act, that said if you had 50 or more families in a town, or 50 more households in a town, they had to pay for a teacher to teach them to read and write so they could read the Bible and not be led astray by Satan. If they had 100 or more towns, they had to build a school. And we start seeing education spread through some of the northern colonies. In the middle colonies, like Pennsylvania and New York, they had schools, but not public schools, but they had private primary schools, so people could go to those. And we know that in the South, they had very few schools at all. Kids that got an education were usually tutored in the plantation home, or they were sent to Europe to get an education. But there was much less of a need for it in the South because of the widespread plantations, no central towns, and the fact that a lot of people didn't live to the point of surviving to need an education, or if they did, it was more about farming. So there just wasn't as much of an emphasis on education in the South. And this gets transferred to higher education. You look at colleges on that map, a lot of our Ivy League schools that we have today go back to this era of the Great Awakening, Harvard being the first. You see Yale and Princeton developed, Princeton in New Jersey, Yale in Connecticut, Cornell, the home of Andy Bernard, up in Ithaca, New York, Dartmouth in New Hampshire. UPenn, University of Pennsylvania, starts as a college of Philadelphia. Ben Franklin's a big supporter of that. All of these schools, except for UPenn, start as divinity schools, schools to train ministers, because that was the profession that mostly needed education at the time. UPenn starts as more of a civic-minded college. Again, it was a College of Philadelphia, develops into University of Pennsylvania, and they're one of the first places that had a medical school. If we look at some of the professions developing during this time, we know that, like I said, ministers was the main profession that you needed an education for, but we start seeing the development of doctors and some kind of standards for doctors. You read about in the book, Cotton Mather was one of the first colonial doctors that experimented with vaccinations. He learned from Africans to try to stop smallpox. So again, vaccinations, the idea that we're going to take a little bit of smallpox, inject it into you with a needle so your body can build up an immunity to it, and therefore you can fight against catching smallpox. But at this time, before some of these professional degrees and emphasis on medicine, some doctors still practice what we consider like really archaic and medieval practices. Like if you're not feeling well, it must be because your blood's poisoned. So we're going to put leeches on you and bleed you out because that'll get the bad blood out of you. So then we start seeing people look a little bit more rationally and scientifically at medicine, just like talk about the Enlightenment, as being a big factor during this time. People looking at more rational ways to develop medical treatment. And by today's standards, they were still pretty basic, but for their standards, they were advanced. We also start seeing people being more trained for lawyers. In the 1600s, if you were accused of a crime or you owed money, you had to go to court. Typically, colonists defended themselves. They weren't professional lawyers. But as the late 1600s and early 1700s developed, there's a little bit more need for lawyers because of the complexity of the mercantile law laws like the Navigation Acts. And as life in America gets a little bit more complex, it becomes more hard for a person to defend themselves, so there's a need for lawyers. This is really important. You think about the development of the American Revolution. Some of our great revolutionaries were James Otis, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry. All these guys are lawyers, and they think about a lawyer. Their job is the art of persuasion, right? Knowing the law and persuading a jury that their argument is right or that their client's innocent. So when these people that are trained in the art of persuasion get inspired by the revolution, they start using that argumentation skills and that persuasion to argue for revolution or against acts like the Stamp Act. We start seeing at this time professional standards for lawyers. People have to pass the bar exam. So we think about not so much an exam then, but pass the bar. The bar was an association of lawyers that got together and decided what their standards would be. And the bar was a physical barrier between the witnesses or you might say the audience of a jury and where the jury actually takes place. In the front of the court where the lawyers sit, the defendant, the prosecutors, and the judge, there's a bar there separating them. And to pass the bar, to get on the other side of the bar, you had to meet these standards of being a lawyer. So these things start happening in colonial culture at this time. So that's developing. We have newspapers being printed. In the mid-1600s, it might have been 4 or 5 newspapers. I think by 1700, there was about 4 or 5 newspapers being printed in the United States, or not the United States, in the colonies. But by the 1760s, we have about 40. They were typically 1 or 2 pages. They might give news from Europe that would probably be a couple months old because how long it took for news to get over there. News in the colonies. There might be editorial essays about something that had people worked up, expressing opinions. There could be ads in there for the products, runaway slaves, indentured servants, anything like that. But people were reading. So we know that Americans had, by European standards, a pretty high literacy rate, which is also, again, important for the revolution because when they start printing arguments against Britain, they print them in newspapers and people can read them. They pass the news in taverns. Benjamin Franklin's a noted political cartoonist, so they even had visuals in some cases for people that weren't literate. The Zenger case, the John Peter Zenger case, some people have studied and written a paper on that, is an important step for freedom of the press. John Peter Zenger was a newspaper writer and publisher who had published some criticisms of the New York governor for rigging elections, for corruption, bribery, and all those things turned out to be true. But English law at the time said you can't criticize governors or the government, even if it's true. It was considered libel, like saying something bad about somebody that was criminal. So John Peter Zenger was arrested for publishing bad things about the governor and put in jail. And Andrew Hamilton, not Alexander Hamilton of the musical fame, but Andrew Hamilton, a lawyer at the time in New York, defended him and said that we're not going to try to argue that what he said wasn't libel, but what we're going to argue is that what he said was true and that newspapers need to be able to print things that are true. So he proved all the allegations of John Peter Zenger were in fact true about the governor, and therefore he should be not be punished for publishing them. He had a famous line that said, "This isn't a trial about one poor publisher, it's about liberty for everybody." And John Peter Zenger was found innocent by the jury and released. So it's a big step for religious freedom for the freedom of the press for the colonies, where they can start publishing things. And that's, again, big for the revolution, where they can print criticisms of Parliament and of the king. Last thing we can look at for colonial culture is just some things like the emergence of a national character. Americans, again, they thought of themselves as British subjects in America, but also a little bit uniquely and different. In America, there was social mobility. Social mobility is the idea that you can move from a lower class to an upper class. There's no laws prohibiting you or keeping you in poverty or as a commoner. So in theory, I think in the South, wealth was based on land, indentured servants, and slaves. So if you lived in the South, you could, in theory, acquire land, acquire indentured servants or slaves, and then become a rich planter and move up in society. Hardly ever happened. Wasn't that easy to do it, but it wasn't prevented by law. In the North, a lot of times social status was determined by wealth, and that was the merchant class for the most part that dominated northern cities. And if you could acquire wealth, you worked hard, and it was you relied on yourself, and you did what you needed to do. You could acquire wealth and move up in society, have a nicer house, all these other things. So the idea of social mobility is important. That doesn't really exist in most of Europe and not in England. If you're a commoner, you're always a commoner. You're never going to be a noble. You're never going to own one of the great landed estates. So that was unique to America. By this time, we have more religious toleration than we see in most of the places in Europe. There's even places like New England where they didn't like Quakers or people that weren't Puritan. They still don't like them, but there's no laws preventing that from happening anymore. People having different religious beliefs. People aren't barred from voting based on religion anymore. That starts to open up a little bit. So there's a little bit more religious toleration in America than you might see in a lot of places of Europe. Voting is different. Think about the habit of self-government. Americans had the practice of voting much more than they did in places of Europe and England. It was still restricted to white men. A few colonies allowed free blacks to vote, but very few. But women couldn't vote, slaves couldn't vote, people that didn't own land often couldn't vote, but there weren't religious restrictions on voting by the mid-1700s. The land requirements were fairly minimal. So people that owned a little bit of land and paid taxes could then vote and have some say in their government. And that had developed in America. Colonial governors, all these colonies at this point are royal colonies. Royal governors are sent over, but oftentimes they had very little power. They had much less power than, say, like a king in England. And colonial assemblies had more say. They voted on laws that affected them. They voted on their taxes. They voted on things that, like internally in the colonies. They accepted the Navigation Acts that regulated trade between them and England and other countries as part of their kind of their role as colonies in the empire. But as far as their everyday lives went, they made those decisions. They voted on things that affected them. And they developed this habit, you might say, of self-government, where they get to do what they want. And when the revolution starts and England starts to try to take that away and get some control over the colonies, they find that to be outrageous. So we'll talk about that a little bit more towards the revolution, but they start to develop the idea that they are the masters of their own fate. So that ends our colonial culture and life in the colonies PowerPoint. The next video will be on wars in the colonies.